Hey y'all, how are you doing? I figured I would share how I came to Cleveland, Ohio, all the way from Los Angeles, California. I've been living in Los Angeles for most of my life, with the exception of my time spent in San Diego for college. But I've been a lifelong resident of Los Angeles otherwise, and after spending a couple years in San Diego, and I came back to Los Angeles, I faced reverse culture shock because Los Angeles had a bigger population and it also had more traffic. So as I grew older, I also realized that I was becoming more introverted and reclusive. I had social anxiety and agoraphobia and misophonia. So I started to evaluate the pros and cons of living in a city like Los Angeles as an introvert. And the thing about Los Angeles is that you don't get a lot of living space. But the whole point of coming to Los Angeles is for the social life and social networking. You sacrifice dwelling space for the public space. So if you're outgoing and you're extroverted, then you're going to really take advantage of the perks and benefits of living in a city like Los Angeles. But since I'm not any of those, I realized that I should probably move to a city that had more affordable housing since I spent all of my time indoors. Other than for essential items like food, I never actually went outside of my house. I didn't do anything recreational. And so I started to look up other cities on the internet that were more affordable. And the way I did this was I Googled best, cheapest city to buy a house. And it came up with a bunch of lists and rankings. And among these lists and rankings, they all had different cities. Some of them overlapped, but depending on who wrote it, it was kind of subjective because some places, some websites, the articles favored livability over affordability. So even livability is subjective based on who you ask. Everyone has a different criteria for what they desire from a city that they live in. So I just went down the list and I would look up the cities on a real estate website called Zillow.com. And Zillow.com, they'll list open houses, houses that are vacant, houses that are up for sale on the market. So I would just enter the city that was on the list. And my criteria for a city that I would actually reside in was a city that had modern day conveniences like easy access to grocery stores and basic utilities like electricity, plumbing, and I also needed internet access. So I boiled it down to a couple cities that were affordable with the budget that I was working with. My mother was going to help me buy a house and she approved me up to $30,000. So I narrowed it down to some places in New York like Buffalo and Utica. I also looked at Kansas City and Pittsburgh. And then I eventually settled on Cleveland, Ohio, because Cleveland, Ohio simply had the most options for the budget that I was working with. So the other places like Buffalo and Kansas City only had a handful of houses that looked like they were move-in ready. So a lot of the houses within my budget were fixer-uppers, and I wanted to just move in straight away. So in Cleveland, there were a lot of houses. So I started to search and actually ask for other people's opinion. And I stated my reasons why I'm moving to Cleveland, just to get a good idea of what people thought. And this one person from Akron actually suggested that I move to Akron, Ohio, instead of Cleveland, Ohio. Akron, Ohio is 1 hour away from Cleveland, and I don't know anything about Akron, or I didn't know anything about it prior to me actually going to Akron, Ohio, because I ended up taking his offer. Because he sold me on Akron because he said that Akron has less of a population than Cleveland, so it's less crowded. And also, he said that it's cheaper than Cleveland to buy a house. So I kind of thought that he knew what he was talking about, and I took the bait. And I started looking for houses in Akron, but this actually did not turn out to be completely true, because even though Akron does have half the population of Cleveland, as it would turn out when I went to Akron, it seemed like it had a bigger population than Cleveland, because it has a smaller infrastructure than Cleveland, so it feels more crowded because it has more population density. And as far as it being cheaper than Cleveland, this was also not correct. But he was well intending when he proposed that I move to Akron instead. So anyway, I did end up looking for houses, and I compiled about 30 houses that fit what I was looking for and came under my budget. And we booked a flight. My mother and I, she was going to accompany me because she said that she would guide me through the process since she is older and she has more experience with looking for houses. So we both went to a motel for 3 days and we looked at about 30 houses, and I learned a lot while I was in Akron. I learned that houses in Akron have basements, and I had never seen or been to a basement in real life, because in Los Angeles proper, it's not the norm for a house to have basements. I've never been to a house, an acquaintance's house or a friend's house that had a basement. And I don't know why this is. I actually looked it up because I was curious why houses in Los Angeles don't have a basement, and there was this one article that theorized that perhaps it was because of the potential hazards if there was an earthquake. But they said that this is a theory that has been debunked because apparently basements have better foundations than houses without basements. So anyway, I digress. The only times I'd ever seen a basement before, or actually heard about it, was when I read about it in Goosebumps books or when I saw it in horror movies. Otherwise, I'd never heard anybody in Los Angeles talking about a basement. So this was new to me and a revelation. So I went down the basements of these houses that I was looking at, and even though basements are great for storage because you're pretty much getting more square footage for your house because it shares almost the same floor plan as your living space on the first floor. The bad thing is that it also tends to attract mold because basements are underground, and so they're colder, they're more damp, less sunlight passes through, and so you have moisture that will not dry since it rains a lot in Akron, so it tends to foster mold growth. So there are actually companies in Akron and Cleveland that waterproof your basement. This was also something new that I learned. There are waterproofing companies that will come and kind of refortify your basement, especially if it's old, because every time it rains, the rainwater will seep through. It'll kind of begin to encroach through the walls, the concrete blocks that your basements are usually made of, or brick, depending on your basement type. So sometimes we would be looking into a basement, we'd be walking down the steps, and our real estate agent would just stop in her tracks and she would say, "This is as far as I'm going. Y'all could go and take a look further and come up. I'll be waiting for you here." And she did this because she detected mold and she was not going to put herself at risk of exposure to inhaling mold because she said that it's unhealthy to actually be in the presence of mold. So she actually stopped going down the steps because a lot of the houses that we looked at actually smelled like mold. And I didn't know what mold smelled like before, but my real estate agent had to educate me on it. So this was also something new that I picked up. So 75% of the houses, as it turned out, had mold. And apparently getting rid of mold is also complicated. So eventually we looked at the other 25% of the houses that didn't have mold, and I liked them all. I had grown up in a small room my whole life, and so anything was considered a significant upgrade for me. And I wanted to move into all the houses if they didn't have mold. But my mother rejected all of them. So on the last day of our trip, our 3-day trip looking at about 30 houses, it was nighttime. I was just laying on the bed and looking up at the ceiling, and I felt so dejected and depressed because we came up empty, and I didn't know why my mother was not liking any of the houses that we were looking at. So I said, "Mother, you will never let me leave Los Angeles." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Mother, you will never let me move out of the house." And she said, "That's not true." And I said, "Then why did you turn down all the houses that I liked?" And she said, "Because they were no good." And she said, "I promise I'll help you find a house." And I said, "Baloney." And she said, "Pinky promise." So we pinky promised, and then we flew back to Los Angeles the next morning. And then for about a month, I kind of forgot about everything. And I sort of settled into the idea that my mother would never let me move out because she had turned down all the houses that we looked at. The other thing is, I also had some insecurities and anxieties that I was dealing with. When I went to Akron, it was not like any city that I'd previously been to. I'd been out of Los Angeles. I'd been to San Francisco, I'd been to San Diego, I'd been to Chicago, Seattle, I'd been to Boston, and New York City as well. And they all felt similar. They all felt like major cities. But when I went to Akron, it had a largely suburban vibe. There were a lot of houses, and the houses really looked nice, but I didn't really get a city feel from it. And it also had a homogeneous makeup, so I was concerned with whether or not the people of Akron would be accepting me, if they would be hospitable to me, if they would welcome me. Not even welcome me, but just not mind me, because I remember just going around Akron and just seeing how everyone looked different than I did. I looked like an outsider. So there was this one time where we went into a shopping mall in Akron. This was because we had extra time on our first day when we were in Akron. We went to the shopping mall. I just Yelped it. And this shopping mall was very nice, but it didn't have much in there. I'm an eclectic shopper, or at least I consider myself as an eclectic shopper. I could occupy myself in almost any shopping mall. I could go to the shoe store, I could go to clothing stores, I could go to places like Abercrombie and Fitch, Hot Topic. I like toy stores, I like bookstores, I like record stores, video stores, memorabilia stores, sporting goods stores. I go to a lot of different places when I go to a shopping mall, but this shopping mall didn't have anything for me. It was mostly catered towards women. And all the people there, the majority of them were elderly people. And they were traveling in big groups. So you would see 6 or 7 women with platinum white hair, the hair done up, and they're looking dolled up, and they're walking perfectly healthy. And they were 60, 70-year-old looking women, and they looked like they could come out on Golden Girls. And I was surprised that none of them required a cane or a walker or a wheelchair to get around. They had even better mobility than I did. So, as we're just walking around and looking at this shopping mall, everybody, as they would pass by these groups of women, they would just stare at me and my mother like we were aliens who had just stepped out of a UFO because we look different. And this is expected because whenever you look different from the homogeneous demographic, you're going to attract attention. And this is also something that occurs elsewhere, not just in America, but even if you were to go to Asia and you were to look different, then the people that are native to that country would probably view you as a curiosity of sorts, just because they're not accustomed to people who resemble you, other than perhaps on television. So this was just extra attention on me, and as an introvert with social anxiety and agoraphobia, I just didn't want that extra attention. I didn't want to attract any more attention, especially not this kind of attention. I don't usually mind attention that you receive because of some kind of accomplishment. If you're being recognized for something that you did, then I think it's well deserved. But just gaining attention just because you look different, I just don't feel is warranted, and it made me feel awkward. So that was something that was on my mind. And then on top of that, we rented a car for our 3-day trip, and everybody in Akron, despite what preconceptions I had of the Midwest and suburban life, drove so fast because I heard from numerous sources. I even heard a study that people in major cities talk faster because they're just more into that hustle and bustle and they need to get places and they have so many things that they have to do. And so they talk faster so that they can move on. And this also means that they drive faster. It's more faster paced to live in a major city. And in the Midwest, apparently people talk slower because they just have more time to spare. And people take things more in stride. They're not in a rush. But this was actually not necessarily the case in Akron because everybody was driving 50 plus miles per hour in big pickup trucks. And so this was kind of hard for me to get used to because coming from Los Angeles, I'm always stuck in traffic, and even on my best day, I'm going 25 miles per hour bumper to bumper. And then here, if you're waiting at a red light and the light turns green, you have to step on the gas. Otherwise, people are going to begin cutting you off and honking at you. So I just felt very hurried and very rushed. It seemed like people in Akron like speed and they just crave speed. They're addicted to the adrenaline rush. And on top of that, the irony was that there were so many cop cars that were ticketing drivers. Every time I would see a car pulled up on the side getting ticketed, presumably for speeding. So I was wondering why everyone was in such a mad dash to speed. I didn't know where they were going. And cop cars also in Akron, they don't have the black and white colors that Los Angeles cop cars have. In Akron, they all have different colors. I saw a gray colored one, a blue colored one, just an all black one. They don't seem to have a uniform color, the police cars. And I think it's because they want to keep some anonymity and they want to kind of catch people off guard. So they have different colors to throw drivers off. So a lot of people are being ticketed, so I didn't understand why everybody was speeding and putting themselves at risk. And also, Akron streets are smaller because even though Akron has a smaller population than Cleveland, it has half the population of Cleveland. It also has a smaller infrastructure, so it actually feels more crowded than Cleveland. After all, this is something that I would learn when I went back to Ohio and went to Cleveland, is that in Akron, it actually feels like there are more people there because some of the major streets only have one lane. And so I had to keep coming back to this one lane where I had to make a right turn into it to enter it. I was coming from a neighborhood street and I had to enter this street, but everyone was driving 50 plus miles per hour and there were a lot of cars. It didn't feel like I was in the middle of nowhere. It felt like a very busy street that is widely used for people commuting back and forth. But making a right turn was very hard to do because I was at a complete stop, waiting in front of a stop sign, and cars kept coming, and it felt like I had to enter into a freeway. But usually with freeways, they give you a ramp to build up some momentum and merge into the freeway, whereas here I'm at a complete stop and I need to make a 90-degree perpendicular right turn. And none of the cars are slowing down for you. So this kind of spooked me. These were just some of the things that I was contemplating at the time. So a month had passed and I hadn't really looked for any new houses because I had doubts about the promise that my mother had made me. But then my mother, she broached the subject. She asked me, "So how's the house searching going?" She said that it would be awfully difficult to move in the middle of winter, so we should probably get a move on before the winter season arrives. So I quickly went back to the computer and started searching for houses. And this time I decided to shift to Cleveland. And I made this shift because we had pretty much looked at most of the houses in Akron within our budget. And when we started looking at Cleveland, it opened up a whole another realm of possibilities. And Cleveland also had a lot more options. for houses because it's a bigger city. It also has more vacancies. So because of the supply and demand, it was actually cheaper in Cleveland. You actually got more bang for your buck in Cleveland. And when I flew to Cleveland eventually, it felt like it was less crowded because it had a larger infrastructure than Akron, Ohio. So we looked around and we found a lot of houses that we liked. And even my mother liked them. And this time we spent 5 days in Cleveland. And at the end, we picked one. And here I am in Cleveland now. Anyway, let me know if you have ever moved out of your hometown or if you have an interest in doing so. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.